Yes.
So hello, everyone. Good afternoon to everyone in the Middle East. Good morning to our North American friends here. I'm really privileged to moderate this virtual roundtable with very distinguished speakers. And since there is a lot to talk about them, I'm just going to read the formal description from the program. We are going to hear today Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami of the Toledo International Center for Peace, who served in several ambassadorial and ministerial positions, and including former Israel's foreign minister. Professor Uzi Arad, the Yuval Herman Workshop for Science, Technology, and Security at Tel Aviv University, who has been former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister and head of the National Security Council in Israel, and Professor Tamar Herman of the Israel Democracy Institute, who is academic director of the Viterbi Family Center for Public Opinion and Policy Research, whose, by the way, whose recent report on the 2020 year has been a masterpiece. So let me, if you'll allow me, to begin by a certain presentation that I suppose may challenge our speakers about thinking about the conceptions we may develop about peace. And let me get you back to the year 1513, when the Scottish King James IV fights the British and loses and gets killed together with his son Alexander. Now, the son Alexander, when he was 14, studied with a great theologian and humanist of the 16th century, Erasmus of Rotterdam. And Erasmus had this to say in his eulogy of the young man who died in battle. Tell me, what had you to do with Mars, the stupidest of all the poets' gods? Your youth, your beauty, your gentle nature, your honest mind, what had they to do with the flourishing of trumpets, the bombards, the swords? Now, Erasmus gave us perhaps the best definition of war ever. War is stupidity. As he wrote in his book, In Praise of Folly, it is not war, let me just see that I can read it. It is not war, the very root and matter of all famed enterprises, and yet what more foolish than to undertake it when both parties are sure to lose more than they can get by the bargain. Now, if you are looking carefully at these words or listening to them carefully, you may identify a notion which we pursue 500 years later, and which in graduate school we heard was labeled the prisoner's dilemma. Erasmus gives us here the prisoner's dilemma, namely two parties that have a mutual interest not to fight each other, and their strategic considerations, their rational strategic considerations, lead them to fight. And this is more or less the lesson that I learned in graduate school when I was exposed to some of the more impressive books on strategic studies at the time, especially the book that had an enormous impact on me, Boulding's Conflict and Defense, Boulding, The Economist, and The Peacenik, who actually tried to cope with the prisoner's dilemma by suggesting that we may build a typology of imagined enemies. For example, do I confront a saint or do I confront a devil? And what would be the strategic moves to take in any of these conditions? For example, how do I reach a stable equilibrium when I am the saint and the other party is the devil? Now, this is, I would say, the basic conception that stems from the prisoner's dilemma and from strategic studies as we understood them in the Cold War and as we continue to understand them as we are thinking about the Middle East. Now, let me just say, since we are talking here also a little bit from a personal perspective, that in graduate school, I was luckily also exposed to the notions developed by Johan Galtung in the Oslo Peace Research Institute, who suggested that this approach is a bit narrow in the following sense, that it deals with violence in the traditional sense in terms of swords and guns and cannons, but violence is something more elaborate or wider than that. Violence, he said, we have to look at violence as structural violence. In other words, structural violence considers all these, the notion of structural violence considers all these variables that lead to the two parties willing to fight each other. You can see the map on the PowerPoint here. The vaccination situation in the world today, that's April, where you can see that parts of the world are vaccinated and parts of the world are not at all, and some are partly. And this is the type of structural violence we have to cope with, said Galtung, in Oslo in those years. And structural violence, I would like to argue, has been, and my colleagues on this very distinguished round table who know more about it may correct me about it, but this this notion has largely underlined the second Oslo agreements between Israel and the Palestinians, in which the negotiations, which were the very elaborate negotiation there, had to do with structural variables, with agriculture and archaeology and banking and commerce and labor and banking and religious sites and social welfare. And the notion having been that it is those structural variables that have to be coped with in order to reach a settlement in the Middle East, even if we are unable to solve the great questions that this conference has been, of course, concerned with over the last 3 days. Now, what I would like to do, almost in conclusion, is of my part, is to read a paragraph from a book I published in the mid-90s, in which I argued the following, and this is going to be my main introduction to this roundtable. What I wrote then, at that time, was the following. The Oslo Accords of 1993 and all subsequent agreements between Israel and the Palestinians were rather consistent with the norms of technocrats, industrialists, businessmen, managers, public administrators, professionals, and other incumbents of the so-called new class. Their norms and interests are clearly reflected in the stress upon economic cooperation as a means to overcome political differences. And if we are asking the question today, why are we in the dire situation in which we find ourselves as far as the peace process is concerned? And what are the reasons for it? I am coming back to the old notion of la trahison des clercs, the betrayal of that new class of intellectuals and professionals and industrialists and economists, the whole Israeli elite that partly because of Benjamin Netanyahu's fight against it in the last 15 years, and partly for reasons that I am not so sure I understand, has largely betrayed its role as carrier of peace in the Middle East. And I suggest that with that, I'm going to leave it. And Shlomo Ben-Ami, you may want to comment on that and on anything else you have to say.
I'm not sure.
having been part of that process, of course.
Mickey, as I understand, Shlomo didn't join yet, and he will maybe join a bit later.
So Uzi, it's your turn then. I thought I see him.
Well, that has been a provocative way of introducing the question. I would rather wait for Shlomo to answer the question and perhaps address the issue of peace in the Middle East as I had construed the subject. Well, but my first comment was to suggest that one thing ought to be corrected right from the outset, and that is the instinctive analogy or equation that people are making that peace means the Palestinians, or that peace in the Middle East means peace within the Palestinian issue. Or when people talk about the Middle East peace process, mostly here and abroad, they think about the peace between Israelis and Arabs, and mainly Israeli and Palestinians. Well, the Middle East by itself is much bigger than that, as we have seen in these very days, but also in the last generation or so. There have been many other conflicts in the Middle East, much more destructive, much more difficult to resolve, by far bigger and greater. We should not include Afghanistan in the Middle East to be able to say that the last 20 or 30 years have been dominated by big Middle Eastern conflicts taking place around the Persian Gulf. Iraq, Iran. We've had a huge civil war, which had international dimensions to it in Syria, which had been much more devastating than anything that had happened between Israelis and Arabs. So when you talk about peace in the Middle East, and particularly even if you talk from an Israeli vantage point, and you look in the future, you should decouple the notion that peace equals the Palestinian issue. It is true that coming to the Israeli perspective, in the past, peace was primarily between us and Arabs. And in all its forms, it took place between either Arab countries or Arab populations on one side and Israel. But it is no longer true that even for Israel, the future issue of peace will be conducted along the lines of the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli issue. But as you can see, it is more and more centered around the conflict between Israel and Iran and its associates and its proxies. That is the main action point. And to some extent, to the extent that we would like to think of peace, and indeed, we would want to think of peace as the positive outcome of anything, and we ought to talk in terms of conflict resolution, which is what peace is all about, then the axis along which one should work for is that between Iran and Israel, or Iran, its proxies, and Israel, and not as, certainly not to be dominated or overshadowed, unfortunately, by the Palestinian issue, which is still there, but the Arab-Israeli issue had been gradually reduced to peace, so to speak, by us having peace agreements with a large number of Arab countries. So the Arab-Israeli dispute in the process is in a process of being resolved gradually, certainly to a lesser and less violent scope than it had been in the past, whereas the Iranian-Israeli conflict is assuming proportions which are very, very disturbing, and peace should also be sought along those lines. So this brings us to the question, how does one define peace? And I would like to employ the language of the practice of things, not the theory of things. The practice of peace, in a kind of a functional definition, is the suppression of the use of force. War being the practice of the use of force and the use of arms, and peace is the denial or the negation of any such use, to reduce the scope of it so that there would be simply violence in its physical form would not be practiced. That's a simple solution or a simple definition, but that is what peace indeed is all about. What is Israel's experience, but primarily what we ought to learn as lessons from the practice of peace-seeking or peace negotiations here in our area and by Israel itself, from the past to the future. From the very beginning, it is true of the Israeli-Palestinian or Arab conflict, and the conflict began more than a century ago, there have been many, many stages in which there had been formalized processes trying to bring about peace or partial peace. What we refer to as diplomacy, what we refer to as negotiations, as bargaining, formal, informal, direct or indirect, any procedure in which efforts were made to resolve the conflict and to bring about either a cessation of the use of force or the limitation of the use of force or the negation of the use of force or the abolition of the use of force and violence. That is what peace was concerned with. I want to suggest to you that in our cumulative history of this process, which has undergone many, many forms and changes, all kinds of lessons have been learned. For example, the first formal process of peacemaking, so to speak, for Israel were the Rhodes negotiations in 1949, where we actually accomplished a very, very serious advancement in the form of a ceasefire. A ceasefire is the cessation of hostilities. Hostilities is the ultimate form of war. So the fact that hostilities, which were manifest in the war, were brought to an end through an agreement is a remarkable achievement, and for which Ralph Bunche, the UN envoy, he received the Nobel, I think, Peace Prize, which is certainly deserved. Now, one of the participants in those negotiations, some of which took place in Rhodes, and some were also conducted elsewhere in the region, one was a young officer called Yitzhak Rabin. And Shlomo, you may remember that from talking to Rabin, but he once told me what has been his main lesson from the Rhodes negotiations. And the lesson was, never negotiate with the Arabs when they're all in the room together. Deal with them one by one, which indeed he practiced that rule, and it had its own logic to it. We could think about that logic later, but the lesson was that it was more conducive to successful conclusion of the negotiations if you dealt with one by one, or because they had different interests, and the form of the conflict that concerned each and one was different from one to another. But that was a lesson that he applied and in his future dealings in peacemaking. Over the years, we've had many procedures to practice diplomacy or to practice statesmanship and peacemaking. And let me refer to some of the modalities. Often we had the United Nations being as the international agency, which was brokering or providing the platform or inserting its own capacity in the process. The UN was involved in 56. The UN even contributed peacekeeping forces, the UNEF, following 56. So the United Nations played a very serious role through various branches of it in the management of the ceasefire, in the preservation of, the verification of, and then in diplomacy. Over the years, the role of the UN had diminished, but not completely. All too often, when peace agreements or peace steps had to be codified, they went through the UN Security General in order to receive the international legitimacy. And clearly, for example, the resolution 242, which had been the cornerstone of negotiations following the 67 war, is a UN product and is defined in terms of the UN resolution. So the UN role is very present over the years. Then we have seen also the direct application of intermediaries, primarily by the superpowers, often being the agents that provide the support or mediate or organize or broker various capacities. We had either the United States alone, which lent it diplomatic weight and capacity in various negotiations, some secret, for example, the latest round of Israeli-Syrian negotiations conducted through American diplomatic officials. But we had the US involved at the Camp David process and several of these efforts. So that is one example. Another interesting example is the co-sponsorship by the Russians and the Americans of the negotiations following the Gulf War. Because of the condition that prevailed in the 90s, we saw primarily the multilateral process being exercised in negotiations in the Middle East, where Israel was just one regional partner, and the Arab-Israeli issue did not dominate that process. Shlomo, you had been leading the Israeli contingent along those multilaterals during the early 90s, I think. I think the refugee issue were managed by you. And that is a very interesting example of the practice of, let's call it peacemaking, the multilateral setting, because I think that as we look into the future, we'll see the necessity for more and more use of such fora to negotiate issues here in the region. So the multilateral, which was split into baskets, and the basket was very much along the lines of the Helsinki process in Europe, but that was the only large-scale exception to unilateralism, to that extent that cannot exist, but to bilateralism or to mediated peace negotiations in the region. The acres management, that of arms control, under the auspices of the Madrid process, which followed and was co-sponsored by the powers at the time, was an interesting example, and it should be looked at. Israel, however, had very limited experience in multilateral negotiations, with one single exception, which was secret at the time, with which we did have, and that was in a way an alliance construction. And that is the trilateral form that we had, Iran, Turkey, and Israel, in which secretly, as members of a trilateral alliance, we managed what essentially was, it was not peacemaking, but was alliance management. And often in managing for peace, you have inside the creation of coalitions and alliances. Let me highlight one aspect of the alliances which become the essence. If you define peace as the absence of war, then there are a variety of ways to have the war being absent, one of which is not necessarily through conflict resolution, but by making it unwise to resort to war. And the most difficult concept underlying such peace is the notion of deterrence. It is interesting that when coming to define the situation that existed between the superpowers in the post-World War II period, it was called the Cold War. Now, why calling that the Cold War? Well, it was a war. It was all right, a war. But because there was no direct, actual use of force, there was putative use of force, but not actual on the battlefield. It was a Cold War, and in that sense, it was a no war. But that was accomplished not because necessarily the outstanding issues between the powers were negotiated or resolved amicably or otherwise. Far from it. It was managed by a mutual fear from war and the destructive effects it would have on each of the parties. So if war is the stupidest of human conducts, then deterrence brought about the control of that stupidity through rationality. And that was the construct upon which deterrence was formed. But what a difficult and costly that concept was. But this should not be denied. One form in which peace can be accomplished in the sense of having no violence and no war is by deterrence. But I caution very strongly against that way of going about it. It has become necessary because at the time, the powers came to possess weapons of such destructive capacity that war did become an impossibility in the sense of any rational choice. And therefore, it had to be structured in such a way that it would not erupt or that no party would be tempted to be the first to use such weapons. And that is what deterrence was. I would argue that this would become more and more the pillar of peace in the Middle East. Now, the way of accomplishing that all too often was through alliance management. And the notion of equilibrium becomes again useful because usually you had to assume that in order to have sufficient countervailing power to the other party, you have to engage in creating the kind of, to create a certain balance. And indeed, often the notion was the balance of terror. The balance of terror was the one that brought stability, and an uneven application or distribution of power between the parties was prone to give one side an advantage that if it became very, very strong, what is usually referred to as first strike capacity was highly destabilizing and was about to be conducive to the use of such weapons. So there we have, and how do you get about into a balance? Often you have it by forming a coalition or an alliance with yourself, one that would be sufficient to present its own counter position to other side, but in a way which is stabilizing rather than destabilizing. Here, by the way, the mechanical notion of instability equals war. So the sacred word became stability, but not stability in the sense of not having people's rise in arms against the regime, but the kind of stability in the threat of the use of force. But that became and will become more a necessity because of the changing nature of war. And we have been discussing about the stupidity of war. Wars were stupid in the 16th century, I can assure you, but those wars you had in Europe were nothing. All they implied was usually the possible death of a local leader or a king and a few thousands of his chivalrous knights and so forth. Compare that to the big wars of the 19th centuries, which employed mass killing, either organized in one way or another, and compare that to the existing such capacity in the world where you have instruments of war which are capable of inflicting enormous degrees of destruction. So this changes everything, just as the changing nature of the battlefield and the changing nature of the weapons is affecting the management of war. So it necessitates changing the management of peace, that is, the absence of war. I refer to deterrence. But then the recent era and some experience we've had also can lead us to some other instruments that have gained strength and may become necessary in the future when we examine the toolkit that we have in trying to get to that point here in the Middle East. To give you just one example, a kind of an abuse of term, the use of confidence-building measures. You know, when you talk to Palestinians, they are often used to either allusions from game theory or from this notion of confidence-building measures. You know, saying like, let the money go through, that will enhance our confidence in the process. That is not at all how this contract came into being, a very useful instrument in war prevention. The concept came into being under the Helsinki process when it became clear that the origin of some of the wars that may happen is because of the absence of trust and because of the fear of surprise attack. So anything that may affect the sense of the possible fear that the other side may attack you by surprise or preempt is conducive to possible either preventive or preemptive actions. And there you have a war breaking out with neither parties actually intending that. So the question became, are there any instruments that can by themselves increase the trust between the parties? The more, but not in a political way by resolving the issues. So a typical instrument like that was the hotline. The hotline that was installed between the powers after the Cuban Missile Crisis did not resolve any of the outstanding issues between the two sides, but they provide an ability to communicate very fast in a way that had been practiced before, so as to discuss under the pressure of a crisis and find ways to contain or control what otherwise may erupt because of some misunderstandings. And misunderstandings are often the causes of violence, not necessarily calculated considerations. But then came other things that have become, if you look into the inventory of confidence-building measures used by the alliances, one category is pre-notification, that each party ought to alert the other party well in advance, 15, 21 days ahead of large-scale exercises, so that large-scale exercises would not be construed or misconstrued for preparations for attack. And how to do that? Well, either you give notice or you allow the observers of the other side be at the other side during the exercises, a whole host of instruments that reduce technically the mistrust and therefore add to the safety net from miscalculations due to absence of trust. But mind you, it is in the nature of all those CBMs that they were identical and symmetrical. Each party was undertaking the same obligations toward the other. That is to say, if we are to provide the other side with pre-notification about launching a missile, they have to do the same thing. It is not the doing of favors. Let me give you more money or military aid and call that a nice gesture, therefore it is a confidence-building measure. No, only if it is symmetrical and it is used by both parties in the same form through regulated mechanisms, it can be referred to as a CBM. I would argue that we would see more and more of that instruments, which are in a way diplomatic, regulated procedures between countries so as to lessen the incidence of war, namely peacemaking. There are other instruments that may be needed in the future. just because of the changing nature of the conflict in the Middle East. Between us and the Palestinians, as was seen before, the list of issues that have to resolve in the context of peace include every aspect of human life because of the nature of this being a conflict over territory in which populations and territories are combined, and it is almost a civil war in a way. And the thing that had to be resolved in this kind of Siamese twins, so to speak, is the fact that there is the interconnectedness and the contiguity between every aspect of life. And that is why the peace has to discuss, if you want it to be full peace, then you have to address all those issues. But between us and Iran, for example, sometimes peace can connote just one main element and does not necessarily have to resolve every aspect of human social, economic, or political life. And that is the case. You see now the negotiations on non-proliferation, which are known as the American negotiations on the nuclear program of Iran, is a classical agenda item in peace, in a way, negotiation in the Middle East through the prevention of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction through the means of single issue negotiations, which is at the heart of the problem. And expanding the negotiations to other areas, such as the missile issue, is refused by the Iranians, which does not reduce from these negotiations their character as being classical, typical peace negotiations in the field of arms control and non-proliferation.
Uzi, I think we are going to let Tammy respond to it, because speaking of provocations, I think you provoked us all right now by getting back to the idea of deterrence and to technological fixes. And I'm sure there are going to be many questions in the end, which I don't want to proceed, but one of them is going to be, how do you apply all these measures to what I call structural violence? But let's leave that for the end, and let's have Tammy respond now.
But please don't call that technical fixes. This is what, if you look today in what is happening in the practice of it, what is the foreign secretary of Russia and America doing as practitioners of diplomacy? Was even the great historian Kissinger, as the practitioner of his knowledge of history, doing with all the SALT negotiations? That is the essence of those matters. Not,
okay. Point is definitely clear.
And sweetie declarations.
Okay, now I'm going to ask Professor Tammy Herman to respond to the other provocation that peace in the Middle East and in general relies on elites, while I suppose that as a foremost public opinion researcher, she may not agree. Tammy, it's yours, the floor. You have to unmute, לא שומעים אותך.
Thank you, Mickey. Thank you, Uzi. As you know, I focus on public opinion. And of course, I think it is important, but I do not think that public opinion shapes foreign policy. I do think that it's a two-road kind of influence, top-down and bottom-up. And when you have a very strong leader, leaders can take publics from one point to another. The question is, do you have such strong leaders as of today? And this is why my main argument would be that first, we should remember the two definitions of positive peace and negative peace. And I'd like to argue that in the Middle East, we talk mostly, actually, I believe almost always, about negative peace, which means the absence of violence in the good cases. Positive peace, which means cooperation, open borders, people-to-people open and free relationships, free transportation of people and goods across borders and between societies. This was never really discussed at least not in the Israeli-Palestinian context, and I don't see it being discussed in the foreseeable future. And my second argument here is that we do not have anymore any peace discourse in Israel. It used to be an issue. It is no longer an issue. And it might, in the future, be revealed that we made a huge mistake. But right now, peace is not in the cards. Even negative peace is not in the cards. And I'll show you some data, very recent data, that we collected that will help me establish my argument. And then I'll give you 8 reasons why I think we are stuck in this very, I would say, unpleasant and maybe very dangerous situation. So here we go. Just a minute, I want to have a full page here. Never mind, we will do it like that. We asked our nationally representative sample in June, I suppose. Now it was July. At the present, which of the following issues concerns you the most? And as you can see, what we got is that the COVID-19 pandemic came first. Then we had the functioning of the new government. Security situation was pointed to as the central concern by only 9% of our respondents, and then came the climate crisis and none of the above. And the fact that we got only 9% pointing to security as the issue did not come as a surprise to us, because in the last, I would say, 2.5, 3 years, Israelis feel secure. They feel secure in the very pragmatic sense of the word. And this is, for example, why they are not ready to expand the security budgets. They think that they get enough security for what they pay, and they don't see security as an immediate threat to the state. Again, I state this is not necessarily the situation, the objective situation, or the situation as it is being perceived by the experts like Uzi, like Shlomo, or by people who think theoretically about the situation, like Mickey did at the beginning of this discussion. But this is how the average Israeli, mainly the Israeli Jewish citizen, see the situation. Security is something that is allegedly granted, and this was the situation even during the last military operation and in former military operations. So security is, of course, connected with the issue of peace, but if peace is meant to increase security, then security is not a main concern as of now by the majority of Israelis, Jews and Arabs alike. In the Arab case, they perceive security more as domestic security within the towns, villages, and cities. But again, when we take them by the hand and ask about security in the sense of national security, they agree with their Jewish fellow men that this is not a major issue as of now. Together with the Chicago Council of Foreign Affairs, we presented a representative sample of Jews, Arabs, and Americans, 3 questions about 3 potential solutions to this Israeli-Palestinian situation. And we asked about the 2-state solution, the 1-state solution, and continuing the status quo. What we found out that only 1/3 of the Israeli Jews see the 2-state solution as acceptable, as opposed to 69% of the Israeli Arabs. And this, of course, is the main bone of contention between these 2 segments of the Israeli population. Then we asked about the 1-state solution, and the numbers were lower on the Israeli Jewish side. Only 15% said that this is acceptable. We did not ask about support. We asked, is this acceptable to you? This was the American question, and they asked their American respondents the same question. 71%, almost the same number of our Arab interviewees said, yes, the 1-state solution is acceptable to them. And it can easily be understood why for them a 2-state solution is good, but also a 1-state solution is good. This will change, of course, the demographic structure of the political entity that will be created when, if and when a 1-state is implemented. And then continuing the status quo, the Israeli Arabs did not like this solution, and only 15% said that this is acceptable to them, as opposed to 41% of the Jewish respondents. And then our American colleagues, they asked us when they got the data, they said, okay, apparently Israelis do not like any of these solutions. And our answer was, indeed, Israeli Jews do not like any of these 3 solutions. They can live better, in their opinion, with the status quo, but they have lost faith in the 2-state solution. They never liked the 1-state solution. So the situation is actually stuck. And this is one of my main arguments. Then we asked about the 2-state solution by political blocs. This is only the Jewish sample, because the Arab citizens of Israel do not fall into any of these political blocs. I don't want to get into this question of why do we take them out, but we do take them out when we segment our sample by political blocs. Of the left, 78% said yes, the 2-state solution is acceptable to them. At the center, 50%, and on the right, only 20%. What we should keep in mind is that these 3 political camps are not equal in sizes, and therefore it is not that we have 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. The right, by self-definition, occupies now about 2/3 of the Israeli Jewish population, very close to 60%, even above 60%, depending on the specific survey. The center is about 25 to 35%, and the left is, in a good day, 15%. So it doesn't really matter that 78% of the left is in favor, or at least see the 2-state solution as acceptable, because they are a very small minority, even when the government is a different government that we had before. Now, we did the 1-state solution by political bloc, and as you can see, only 15% of the left agree that this is an acceptable solution. Then on the center, we had 30% and only 7% on the right. So this means that these political blocs are not in favor of the one-state solution. And of course, the 7% on the right that find the one-state solution acceptable have very different reasons why they accept it. These are very different than the reasoning given by people of the left. In both cases, these are the extremists in these two political camps. And if we look at the status quo, then 50% of the self-defined right respondents said, yes, they can live with the status quo, about 1/3 of the center, and only 12% of the left. This tells you that there is no consensus. All these slides that I showed you, there is no consensus in Israel what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And here it was segmented by parties, the only parties of the coalition. So the two-state solution is mostly favored by Meretz, Ram, then Labor, blue and white. Yesh Atid is half and half, and Yemina only 12%. Yemina voters, that means. One-state solution, only the voters of Ram are in favor of. And then continuing the status quo, we see that Yemina is and Labor are the two parties that are in favor, blue and white as well. So if we take these numbers into consideration, I'd like to give you 8 reasons why I think that this is the situation. So the first and most obvious reason is the electoral shift rightward. Peace is not something that the right is very keen on paying the price for. I'm not saying that people on the right do not like the idea of peace or they would not like to have peace, but they are clearly uninterested in paying the price for peace, at least in terms that we think as of today as the price for peace. And indeed, I know of the Bar Ilan speech and so on and so forth, and the fact that there was a time immediately after this speech that more people of the right agreed that peace is desirable and were ready to opt for the two-state solution. This is in the past and no more a concrete solution in the eyes of those who define themselves as being on the right. Then we have the fact that we are in a deadlock for many years. So people are looking back to the past and they look at the present and they said, actually nothing changed. I mean, basically no structural situation, no new structural situation emerged in recent years, no new leadership on the other side. The Gaza and the West Bank differences are not making it more hopeful, and therefore they say, okay, we are stuck. Maybe we will be stuck for 100 years from now, and we can live with it. And this brings me to the third explanation, and this is the sense, the widespread sense amongst Israelis that there is no price for the continuation of the status quo. Actually, when we ask the Israelis, do you think that you personally, or Israel as a nation, or Israel as a state, pay an unbearable or bearable price for the continuation of the status quo? They say, no, we don't feel that we pay any price for that. This is, of course, very different when we compare notes with my colleague Khalil Shkaki, who does the same thing amongst the Palestinians. There, the sense of the price of the present situation is very high. So there is a huge discrepancy between Israelis, even Israeli Arabs, and the Palestinians in terms of is it painful? And for most Israelis, the situation is not painful, or some people would say not painful enough. then when they look at the option of peace, they realize that they will be asked to pay a very high price for it. And the price, of course, is territorial, but even more so, people are afraid of high costs of a resumption of the peace talk, and certainly signing of a peace agreement in terms of the domestic homogeneity or the widening of the gaps between various parts of the Israeli Jewish society. And they recall the 90s and the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, and they simply do not want to go back there. And no one can guarantee that if a peace proposal is put on the table and confirmed by the authorized institutions, this situation will not deteriorate into, if not a civil war, then some clashes that will, of course, jeopardize domestic homogeneity. Then we should also take into consideration the fact that the leaders of the nation or the leaders of the state do not talk about peace for years now. They do not put peace as even an abstract target or aim or goal or aspiration. No one talks about peace anymore. And if the leaders do not talk about peace, and they do the agenda setting by and large, of course, on sometimes you have a pandemic that creates a new set of goals, but the leaders do not put it on top of their priority scale as something to be attained during their terms in office. We have other problems that are more severe, at least in the short term. And then people are talking about the pandemic, they talk about the economic situation, and beforehand they talked about the internal splits within the Jewish population. The splits, socioeconomic, ideological, and others, were considered as much more dangerous to the well-being of the nation than the issue of security / peace, and so on and so forth. And when we present them with a list of issues and ask what is the issue that the government should take care for first or first and foremost or in the foreseeable future, the issue of peace always, if we had 5 issues, then it came 5th. If we had 6 issues, it came 6th. So it always came as the last thing that we put on the table, as the last thing that it is favored by our interviewees. One should also keep in mind that there is no real external pressure on Israel. And this goes hand in hand with the price that is not paid for the status quo, because if there were real external pressures on Israel, including sanctions and other measures to be taken by the international community, maybe Israelis would have thought differently about the peace as an asset. But this is not the case. I mean, indeed, we listen and we hear condemnations from here and there, and some kind of semi-pressures coming from Europe and others, but no real pressure was put on Israel thus far. And indeed, many people on the radical left, they call for external pressure on Israel. And this is another reason why it is not. And my last reason of why peace is not in the cards right now is that no tempting enough solution is put on the table. The two-state solution was not revived in any way. It was not revised in any way. It was not modified in any way. So people attribute the two-state solution to a failing process and failing leadership. And when they hear the two-state solution, they hear something that failed and did not work out. And if this is workable, in order to start a new peace process. Maybe the content can stay the same, but the packaging should be very different for people to hang to and lend their support to a new peace proposal agreement.
Thank you very much, Tammy, for a very interesting presentation. Let me just, again, I don't want to proceed any questions. I want to leave some time for questions. Let me just say that it would be very interesting, although it's not politically correct, to break down your data by the type of elites that I spoke about that do have an interest in breaking the status quo, the economic elites, the industrialists, those people who have those interests, and the rest of the population. But I suppose that Professor Ben-Ami, who actually participated in many of these processes that we discussed here, may have either some optimistic or pessimistic vision for us. Shlomo, bevakasha.
Before, excuse me, I will for 1 minute take the place of the time officer and remind you that our session is going to end at 5:30. And you have 2 questions on the chat. So after Shlomo will give his answers, please pay attention to these 2 questions. Okay? You can go on.
Shlomo, please. Unmute
you have to
yourself.
unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Well, I'll start again.
Yes.
Uzi gave us an excellent presentation because he's particularly proficient in broad strategic matters, and Tamar was equally interesting with her detection of public opinion trends with regard to the conflict. I'm afraid I'm going to be slightly more provincial, that is, and I'll focus on the Israel-Palestinian situation with two emphases. Try to understand why today we are in a condition where the Palestinian state, the idea of a Palestinian state, has never been more remote in terms of its applicability than since the start of the peace process 30 years ago. By the way, we are now marking the 30th anniversary of the Madrid Peace Conference, which launched the peace process. And there are 2 basic reasons, I think. One is, say, the technicalities, the human condition. And the second has to do with what I would call the impersonal forces of history, structural issues that have made the conflict so resistant to a solution. Now, when it comes to the technicalities, as it were, we'll have to start somewhere, and I choose to start in Oslo. I mean, Oslo was a brilliant exercise in backtrack diplomacy. There shouldn't be any doubt about it, but it failed in its historic mission, and that is to make possible the 2-state solution. Oslo in itself was full of lacunae. It left the nature of the final solution or the end solution wide open, and therefore it became a standing invitation to the parties to try and have an influence on the nature of the final settlement, the Israelis by building settlements and the Palestinians through terror. So this was an equation that accompanied the Oslo process from the start, that the parties knew that they are going to engage in talks for a final settlement. And since at least the Israelis believed that the nature of the final settlement was open, so they did whatever they could to influence the nature of the final settlement. And the Palestinians didn't think that they have to invest much gray material in the subject, because they saw the problem as a clear-cut issue of decolonization. That is, that Israel needs to withdraw from the territories according to UN resolutions, and this is essentially what it is. So the parties came to the negotiations without an agreed platform, without an agreed framework. The Palestinians came with the idea that they are going to talk about 1967, but also about 1948, the narrative issues. And the Israelis thought they came to negotiate the 1967 issues. One major difference between the one of many reasons that distinguish the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts from other conflicts is that narrative issues, if you take, for example, Northern Ireland, or you take Colombia, narrative issues were postponed to be dealt with after the political issues were resolved. In the case of Israel-Palestine, the narrative issues, which are this kind of intangible problems that normally are much more difficult to address than the tangible issues, the Israel-Palestinian process wants or asks the narrative issues to be resolved now, here and now, which hasn't happened in any other peace process. So this is because when it came to territory, if I can take, Michael mentioned my humble experience, if I can take, say, Taba, well, you know, we had differences over territory, but they were solvable. We could solve them. But what we could not solve was Jerusalem and refugees. That is the narrative, the narrative problems. If you take Northern Ireland or Colombia, they postponed the issues. They said, okay, now we have, because you know these conflicts or these processes in Northern Ireland that people tend always to compare with Israel-Palestine, this was essentially a process about a trade-off between decommissioning, that is disarmament, and political participation. This is essentially what it was. I'm not saying that there are not ethnic problems, religious problems, the disparities between Catholics and Protestants that persist to this very day. All this existed, but the process as such was a very, very narrow affair. It was about decommissioning in exchange for political participation or power sharing. And this was essentially also about Colombia. So this makes the Israel-Palestinian situation into a nightmare and something that, as you can see, we could not resolve. And so between pessimism and optimism, you know, they tend to see it, to say that a conservative in America is a liberal that was mugged in Central Park. So I think that when you sort of accumulate this kind of experience, you sort of see why it has been so difficult to resolve it. Now, again, I go back to Oslo. Another thing about Oslo was that it was an attempt to bypass the peace parameters of the Madrid Peace Conference. The Madrid Peace Conference spoke about a Jordanian-Palestinian solution implicitly, because there was a Palestinian-Jordanian delegation, and what the Palestinian we had negotiations in Washington, and the Israeli government, Rabin's government, could not obviously respond to the requirements of the Palestinian delegation, because they asked what every nation under occupation should ask. That is full independence, sovereignty, 1967, and what have you. The Rabin government could not respond to such requirements, and they went to Oslo. For Arafat, bypassing Madrid and bypassing Washington, more than a strategic or the decision of a statesman in quest for peace. I'm not saying he was not in quest for peace, but yes, for him it was a political exercise in order to get back to the territories as soon as possible and neutralize the local leadership. Because you see, the PLO that started in 1964, or the Arafat PLO, conducted its war against Israel, represented the Palestinian cause internationally, and suddenly the most important thing that happens to the national Palestinian movement, the first Intifada, is something that, and we are still reasonably young, and we remember the first Intifada. It gave such publicity to the Palestinian cause, and suddenly it was not Arafat, it was Faisal Husseini, the people here. For him, he was ready to pay a very high price in order to come back to the territories. Oslo is an agreement between a national movement and Israel, where the national movement doesn't even mention the concept of self-determination. It says nothing about self-determination. It says nothing about settlements. He was in a hurry to get back to the territories. This is why he went to Oslo. So we have a problem about the contours of the final settlement that were left open, and they were open to different interpretations by the parties. The Palestinians would tell you, yes, we already made our major concessions in 78% of historical Palestine. Now we cannot, negotiate as you want us to negotiate and offer counter proposals to your proposals, because we have already given everything back. Rabin and Peres, both of them, the architects of Oslo in some way, they always used to speak about a state minus. They never spoke about a full-fledged Palestinian state. And then you have the framing of the conflict as a decolonization process. This was very much in the mind of Arafat. You all remember the Durban conference in 2001, and speeches by Arafat, and we have this fantastic book by Rashid Khalidi on the colonialist dimension or colonial dimension of the conflict. And of course, one cannot deny that Israel's practices in the West Bank have all the traits of a colonialist, of colonial occupation. Yet there is a difference. And the difference lies in that, to begin with, I am not aware, maybe some of the participants are, of a struggle for national liberation from the colonial power that lasted for 74 years in Israel and 54 years in the occupied territories. And even if it were a strictly colonial problem, the comparison with other colonial powers in history doesn't really stand, because they were all of them were empires overseas. And this technical item makes it extremely central to the problem. Just imagine what would, even assuming, I accept that this is, for the sake of the discussion, that this is a colonial occupation, and all the talks by the Israeli right are rubbish. I mean, nothing to do. Israel has nothing to do there, and it is a colonized territory, etc. And let us accept it. But just imagine, as an exercise, what would Great Britain have done if, say, Kenya was a contiguous territory to the UK, or Algeria was a contiguous territory to France? I guess they would have negotiated security issues in a no less tough manner than we did. And perhaps even they might have been incapable of reaching an agreement, who knows? Now, this betrays the concept of an end of conflict, because in the case of Israel-Palestine, end of conflict is also about state building. End of conflict for Great Britain in Kenya had nothing to do with state building. Kenya or Ghana or any other African or Asian country. These countries faltered down the way. They engaged in civil wars. Democracy collapsed in some of these ex-colonies, but nothing happened to the colonial power, because the colonial power was 5,000 miles away. So I think that the nature of the conflict, even if you accept that it is a colonial conflict, makes it so very different than what we have known in any other case.
Shlomo, we have to stop here because the time is running out. As they say on CNN, our satellite time is almost over.
Okay.
So just a concluding statement.
You want me to conclude?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, of course, one could elaborate further. What just remains for me to say is that I can see a couple of possibilities for the future. And I don't see that there is a way that the all peace diplomacy can be revived. And not even the American administration believes in it. I think this is the first American administration in more than 30 years that hasn't sent an envoy, a peace envoy to the region. The two-state solution is something that has become unpleasant to speak about in polite, even in impolite society. And therefore, I don't see that we can address this as something that is real in the foreseeable future. But I believe that the DNA of Zionism, in spite of the hegemony of the Israeli right in Israeli politics for the last years, I believe that the DNA is more about demography than about territory. And that has been the case in the past. If you look at 1948 and we look at the disengagement in Gaza, etc. So at some point down the road, I believe that some kind of unilateral convergence might happen. This is not a desirable solution, because God knows what would happen beyond the border. But bear in mind that those who speak about a convergence plan maintain that the IDF should stay beyond the demarcation line. In any case, so it will be the continuation of the war in different conditions. And the second possibility is the one we are seeing right now, and it is a one-state reality developing by osmosis. That is, it is not a wedding, it's not a marriage, it's a reality that is happening by itself. I am a strong believer in the Jordanian option. But I know that the best way to be thrown out of the window if you go to see King Abdullah these days is to tell him that you want a Jordanian solution. But what I have in mind is not the Jordanian solution that the Israeli right has spoken about. That is that saying that, okay, we already have a Palestinian state and that is Jordan. No, absolutely not. But then I don't see a way of solving the problem either through, as I say, unilateral convergence that doesn't really solve the problem, but this is an option that responds to Zionism's DNA. And the second is the one state that we see developing. I call it a South African situation without a South African solution, because the Jewish minority will under no condition allow equal power sharing in such a South African situation. And the only third idea that I can think of is being more creative in the kind of relations that can be created between Jordan and the Palestinian territories.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. Hagit, do we have time to answer some of the questions on the chat? Uzi, Tamar, have you seen the questions addressed at you?
Mickey, we have 5 minutes. So...
Okay, so may I suggest that those who ask the questions ask them in person rather than on chat, so it would be easier.
It was Ariel, Kabiri, and Nissim?
Yes, and the answers are going to be very, very brief.
First is my question. Regarding your idea of prisoner's dilemma, I wonder, let's assume that we get peace with all parts of the Palestinians. Should we get peace with Iran and Yemen and Algeria? Should the hostility stop? And if you talk about the prisoner's dilemma, is the payoff, when you're talking about the equilibrium, you should talk about payoff and the motivation. What is the motivation of the hostility of the Iranians? Is it rational? Can you put it as quantity numbers into a matrix and get an equilibrium?
Nissim, in terms, as an economist, you probably know Boulding, who is an economist very well, and it was Boulding who suggested that when I am the saint and the other guy is the devil, then I am in problem. However, I just think that our very distinguished speakers here gave the answer to your question. For example, Shlomo Ben-Ami spoke about the difficulty to overcome narratives in Oslo. The question is whether really the narrative has to be the one that Uzi, for example, presented about Iran. And it's almost a question to Shlomo, why can't we really, and to Tami too, can't we actually assume that the narrative is going to change so that the type of issues that Shlomo negotiated in Oslo B, in Taba, like water and agriculture and all these things would become the narrative rather than some of those crazy narratives that you had to cope with at the time. So I think that also about Iran, I think the saint devil narrative may change the moment the elite is going to look more carefully into it than Netanyahu presented the issue to us for his own political gain. Uzi, I suppose you have something to say about that, huh?
I have a difficulty with your insistence on the centrality of the elite issue, and certainly on placing some responsibility in a way to elites to perform one way or another. From all I can tell, it is difficult to define what is the Israeli elite. There are various elites. If you talk about the elite of the establishment, so to speak, the one which is involved in policy making and so forth.
No, Uzi, excuse me. I was talking about mainly about the economic, about the industry and high-tech.
Yes, the economic, there is a bit, you could notice, for example, and I'll give you just one example, when the economic or business elite had an interest of its own, and it was manifest and played a role. Right. When the issue was about 10 years ago, whether Israel should go on a preventive attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities, it was clear that the business community felt that such an attack was bad for business. And right they were. You could easily think that the morning after such an attack, whichever way it was, successful or unsuccessful, the stock market would drop by significant amount.
Yes, and after Oslo 93 was announced, the stock market raised, I think, what was raised like 40% up, was 40% up, which is exactly my point. That that these elites may be the important thing to look at. Even in Tammy's data, I think that they may come, that their betrayal may be responsible for this status quo.
Why do you think this is a why do you think this is a betrayal? In fact, the betrayal is in the fact that a group in Israel gave preference to its own interest, in this case, money making, to be an issue on a matter which was the national security of the state.
Exactly, and that's why what I'm arguing is that they have
in one sense.
I don't want to take the whole floor. So,
Ariel, the point is that the business community, in this sense, was yes, it was a pro-peace thing. It looks as if peace is good for business. But let me call your attention that in recent days, there is reference sometimes that the peace, if we used to have a word of the peace of the brave, now we have the word, the peace of the crooks. Think of it.
Tammy? You want to respond to? Or Shlomo, yeah, please.
I
think Tammy is trying to answer, but we can't hear you, Tammy. And just look at the time, and we will take 2 more minutes. Okay?
Agit, you can go on for a few minutes.
Yes.
Can I?
Yes.
I think you should differentiate between Arab states and the Palestinians. If you take, for example, the Gulf states, obviously there is a great motivation that comes from economic considerations, because these are independent states. They are trying to be global. They trust Israel's high-tech economy, etc. But the Palestinians are in a revolutionary stage. They are not in an economic stage. Of course, nobody's against economic development. But in such conditions, the national or the nationalist drive is paramount. It's not the economic one. I remember negotiations with the Palestinians. They were not really interested in economic issues. They were interested in a national solution to the Palestinians' plight, refugees, borders, settlements, and you could not. There is an article in Iron Wall, Zev Jabotinsky's article. He speaks about don't think that you can buy out the Palestinians with subsidies. He was right then and he's right now. So because this is a revolutionary stage, which is not the stage where the Emiratis or Qatar or these other guys are. So this is a major difference that I think we need to bear in mind when we try to negotiate peace with the Palestinians, as opposed to peace with Arab states.
Tamar? Okay. We just read it, but you want to say it? No, we can't hear you. Oh, we can't hear you. So we'll have Ariel Kabiri ask the last question.
I pass, okay.
Okay, so the last word has been said, I think, by all of us. I mean, we all don't know where it's going, but we all hope it's going in the right direction. And I'm really, I really suggest that Professor Nissim Ben David, maybe you conclude the entire conference this way, the president of Western Galilee College.
Thank you. We have 3 very busy and interesting days. And the final session was very interesting as well, with interesting ideas. I think that we could go on with the conference more, but next year we are going to schedule another conference, and I hope that some of the participants today will agree to come and participate next year as well. I thank all of you for your time and for you agreeing to come to participate in the conference. And I'm sure that some of the products will serve, I hope, will serve policymakers and us to develop ideas regarding how to come to better state regarding peace in the area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and see you next year.